My talk is going to be about the challenge of feeding the world at 9 million people and what is the promise of agroecology. Today we have two paradigms that are dominating agricultural systems in the world. One is the industrial agricultural system based on the Green Revolution, high technologies, and the other one is the peasant agriculture, small farmers model that follow more agroecological methods. 80% of the 1.5 billion hectares of agricultural land in the world are managed by monocultures of large scale that actually are highly vulnerable and exert a huge ecological footprint. For example, in the UK, if we start considering the impacts of industrial agriculture, it would be about 208 pounds per hectare when you take into consideration the impacts on biodiversity loss, human health, soil erosion, water contamination, and also the fact that the industrial agricultural sector, including the transportation of food, produces about 35% of the global greenhouse gases that are changing the global climate. Also, this agriculture is proving to be highly susceptible to climate change. The monocultures that dominate, for example, the Midwest of the United States, in 2012, they were subject to a drought that allowed the production to drop in about 30%. That shows the vulnerability that the systems have to climate change. But interestingly enough, and this is recognized also by many international organizations, that this industrial sector, which occupies 70 to 80% of the arable land, uses 70% of the water, 80% of the fossil fuels, produces a lot of the greenhouse gases, produces only 30% of the food that we eat at the global level. And still, we have more than 925 million people that are hungry, but also the contradiction that there's a lot of food that is being wasted, that all this food that is being wasted could be fed to Africa, for example, if it was magically transported there. There's another model, the one that I work on, which is the small farmers. In Latin America and Japan, in Asia, Africa, everywhere, we find small farmers. There's about 1.5 billion farmers, small farmers, peasant farmers, we call them, campesinos, occupying about 380 million farms, and their farms are about 2 hectares in size maximum, but they have in their hands about 1.9 million crop varieties, so they have the rich agricultural heritage of genetic resources for the future of humankind. And these farmers that only control 25 to 30% of the agricultural land, 30% of the water use, and only use 20% of the fossil fuels, produce 50 to 75% of the food that we eat, depending on the country. There are countries like Brazil, for example, where 80% of the food is produced by small farmers. So these small farms are not strange, obviously, to Japan, although these pictures are from China. You find that in these rice systems, the reason why they are so productive is because the systems are very rich in biodiversity. You're familiar with the fish rice systems, where the fish play an important function in controlling the weeds, in controlling the insect pests, and also the growth of azolla that can provide nitrogen to the rice without needing external fertilizers. But at the same time, this can provide food for ducks who come in and start eating this azolla, eating insects, weeds, and other things. At the end, the farmer practices agroecology by ensembling a biodiversity that allows the interactions between the rice, the fish, the ducks, the microorganisms, the insects, and that allows the system to basically sponsor its own function. This is what agroecology is the possibility of designing farming systems that are going to be able to sponsor their own function, because the interactions that happen between the biodiversity components are basically promoting biological control, nutrient cycling, and productivity of the systems. So the challenge of the future then is that we need to increase production. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition to deal with the problem of hunger. And we have to do it sustainably, but with the same amount of arable land, or maybe less, with less petroleum, less water, less nitrogen, and in a scenario of climate change. And what agroecology says is that this challenge cannot be met with the existing industrial agricultural model and its biotechnological derivations, and what we need is a new paradigm, a new model. This model of agriculture has to be based, decoupled from fossil fuel dependence. It has to promote agroecosystems of low environmental impact that are nature-friendly, that are resilient to climate change, that are multifunctional because they also promote not only the production of food, but they also promote ecological services, social services, preserves culture, and they have to be the foundations of local food systems because by the year 2030, 80% of the population is going to live in cities, and the cities of more than 10 million people are going to triple in size, and one city of 10 million people has to import 6,000 tons of food per day, which travels about 1,000 kilometers. That's totally unsustainable. We need to start working on local food systems and not more with global systems. So the sustainable systems that we're talking about have to be promoting social equity, social justice, environmental sustainability. They have to promote local economies, good health by accessing good food for the people, healthy food, and it has to be culturally appropriate. Agroecology, then, is a science that is based on some of the Western paradigms of science, including the social sciences, the biological sciences, the agronomic science, but also the traditional farmers' knowledge, the farmers' knowledge that has been accumulated for centuries. And creating a dialogue of wisdoms comes up with principles that take different ecological forms depending on the socioeconomic, biophysical conditions. And these principles then are general, for example, enhancing soil organic matter, increasing the genetic and species diversity, maintaining landscape heterogeneity, maintaining biological control of pests, enhancing biological interactions, etc., enhancing recycling of nutrients. These principles then will take different forms, technological forms, depending on the community in which it's going to be practiced. Now, there's a lot of evidence from many reports, including IPES, including the ISTD, including even FAO, saying that a significant potential social and environmental gains from transitioning toward agroecological agriculture is the way to nourish current and future populations sustainably. Millions of farmers have adopted and spread agroecology through horizontal exchanges of information and practices, and such initiatives were implemented with less than 10% of the funding that is devoted to international centers of, for example, the CEIR, that uses a lot of money and has not had the tangible positive impacts on crop yields than the agroecological initiative. So the returns on the investment on research are huge in agroecology. Now, a lot of people say, well, if agroecology is so great and it has such a great potential, why is not being adopted more widely than by farmers? There are many barriers to the spread of agroecology. The lack of enabling policy environments, the lack of right incentives, the absence of special markets, little funding available for research and extension. For example, the University of California research, 1% of the research funding for agriculture goes to organic farming. 99% goes to conventional agriculture. And also there's a low number of trained professionals and farmers because it's not being used, people are not being trained in the universities on agroecology. But the real lock-in in preventing a transition to agroecology lies in the control of the food systems, seeds, technologies, information, and outlets, as well as the research agendas of public universities, which are being penetrated by corporations today funding research for high-input agriculture. This is just one example of the market concentration in multiple sectors related to agriculture. 3 companies control 60% of the commercial seed market. 7 companies control major fertilizers, and so on and so on. This concentration then has created what we call food empires that control the food system. They strangle the food system, and they determine what producers are going to produce, how much, for whom, with what technology, but at the same time, through big supermarkets, they control what consumers are going to eat, the quality of the food, and how much the food is going to cost. So we need to transform the food systems, and for that we need to scale up agroecology. We need to create alternative food networks, and that the food is healthy and accessible to all, not just to the middle class that can afford healthy food, but to everybody in the world. Well, let's look at some examples on how this transition has happened. One is taking opportunity of a crisis. In Cuba, as you know, in 1989, when the Soviet bloc collapsed, Cuba had, before that, an agriculture that was highly industrialized, sponsored by the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, in 1992, there was a drop in the imports of fertilizers, pesticides, petroleum in more than 60%. Obviously, all the industrial agriculture collapsed. But the one that did not collapse was the small farmers. You can see the clear lane, the clear bar, is different crops. You have different crops. That's the contribution before there was no fertilizers and pesticides. And the black bar is after the collapse. So the small farmers were able to provide food without inputs, without fertilizers, because that's the way they were doing it. Imagine tomorrow that we close the entrance of fertilizers, petroleum, and pesticides to Japan. What would happen with the agriculture? And how do they do this? They do it by using different agroecological technology, diversification, green manures, and different practices. This is one example of a farmer in Cuba where he started with a monoculture, transformed it into a very diversified farm, as you can see at the bottom. And you can see that the total productivity, which is the blue line, was maintained. But the difference is that in 1995, it was producing 2 crops, and in 2006, it was producing 12 crops. And you can see that the inputs required went down to almost 0. That is the orange bar. So more productivity with less resources from the outside. And as you can look at the system, they could feed, with the production of 1 hectare, 34 people per year. So if they have 10 hectares, they could produce enough protein for 340 people with an energy efficiency of 30. They put 1 kilocalorie and they get 30 back. There's no more energy efficient agriculture than that. In the United States, the average energy efficiency is 1.5. This is 20 times more energy efficient. In Chile, we did some systems also many years ago for small farmers. This is a half hectare, 1 acre plot of land. I don't have time to explain how it was organized, but basically what it did is that it produced enough food to feed a family of 5, cutting down the production cost in 50%, and then there was a surplus that generated income for the family. So the family didn't have to buy food because it was totally self-sufficient. They didn't have to buy inputs, and they could sell the surplus. So what agroecology does is increases the autonomy of farmers from the markets, from the inputs, and so on. Now, the other issue is that there's a lot of degradation of the environment going on in rural areas, and there's a lot of farmers now that are controlling territories to create what is called agroecological territories. So this is in the Mixteca region of Mexico. You can see the erosion that happened there because of many factors. And there are families that decided to stay there. What is the future of these people? These people have to migrate to the United States or to Mexico City, whereas they wanted to stay there. So they engage in a huge restoration of the rural landscapes using soil conservation practices, water harvesting, et cetera, which allow them to produce food again, even in the midst of drought, and be able to be self-sufficient. Another example is here from Colombia, where you can see in 1992, the community had very little forest in the watershed. By 2016, there was a total reforestation effort which allowed the water to be available again for farming. So 75% recovery of the forest, water now available to 75 families instead of 25, diversification of production, it reduced 70% of the external inputs, and the food security of the community increased to 90%. How does this innovation spread? Is through the campesino movement, which is a farmer-to-farmer network. So you can see in Cuba, when they dropped of the Soviet bloc, there were 216 agroecological farmers, leaders, promoters. Now there's more than 130,000 because basically there's a system of horizontal exchange of information in which one farmer comes from another community, teaches other farmers a particular practice like soil conservation, and then each one of these farmers becomes a multiplying effect. So it grows very quickly at a very, very efficient cost. So in Central America, for example, many of the farmers have done this, and you can see also that these systems become more resilient to climate change. This is right after the Hurricane Mitch, and you can see the farms that had monocultures suffered more damage than the agroecological farms that were managed with diversification schemes. Now, agroecology is not just part of the academia or the NGOs, it's part of the social movements. Today, it has been taken as a transformative science committed to a more just and sustainable future by reshaping the power relations from farm to table. And what they promote is called the concept of food sovereignty, which is different from food security. Food sovereignty is the right of a country or a region to decide their own production model. And for that, you need social movements, you need agroecological strategies, you need the state to support these social movements in their agroecological initiatives, but you also have to provide access to land, water, and seeds to the communities. So there's many, many alternative food systems that are being promoted in the Global South. Also here in Japan, there's some very interesting arrangements, like the TK, for example, like local exchange of systems, local markets, on-farm direct consumption, producer and consumer cooperatives, local credit associations, collective kitchens, et cetera, many, many arrangements that basically are democratizing the market access for family farming. So, for example, this is one example in Brazil, where there's a tremendous, in the northwestern and northeastern part of Brazil, in the semi-arid, where there's a tremendous amount of local networks in which consumers and farmers are getting together to promote these farmers. There's another arrangement in the southern Brazil called Ecovida that encompasses about 180 municipalities, approximately 12,000 people, and basically is promoting these arrangements which we call alternatives to the global market system. Now, the social movements have been able to push governments, especially progressive governments, like Ecuador, Bolivia, Guatemala, Brazil, Venezuela, Nicaragua, where agroecology is becoming part of the legislature. For example, Brazil has a national law of agroecology, which was the product of the pressure of social movements. And one of these programs is called the School Lunch Program. 30% of the food that is produced by small farmers, the government buys to sell it, to take it to the schools. This is impacting 2,000 municipalities, and 45 million students per day are being fed through the system with healthy food promoted by small farmers. So basically, these food empires, what we are talking about is creating what we call a bypass in which autonomous territories are managed by farmers, creating local solidarious markets with the consumers that understand that eating is ecological and also a political act, and that the bypass functions under a capitalist society, but is not totally ruled by capitalist rules of engagement, where there's a lot of solidarity happening between consumers and producers. So we need to scale up agroecology. It's possible, but we need to have farmer-to-farmer networks, more funding, enabling public policy environment, empowering women, making strategic alliances between the researchers, the NGOs, and the social movements, and the consumers also acting in solidarity, because eating, as I said, is a political and ecological act. So what are the drivers that we need then to promote, to massify agroecology? For example, the existence of a crisis, like in Cuba, that's a very interesting driver in which many of these alternative models are being promoted. Social organization, because the social fabric for the growth media of agroecology is the social organization. We have to have networks of exchange of information and knowledge and practices between farmers, researchers, etc. We have to have a very effective agroecological practices that work, mobilizing discourses, leaders that are promoting this discourse, external allies, favorable markets, favorable policies. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。